Okay, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for providing me with quite a lot of material over the years that I've used on my sort of personal crusade in a slightly smaller world for randomised trials in education. Yeah, so I trained in science and statistics myself. Okay, I'll move it up a bit, I think. Ooh. Yeah, I trained in science and statistics myself, and when I arrived in the world of educational research, I was I just could not understand why the things we were working on were evaluated not using randomised trials, so using quasi-experiments, observational studies, and so on. And initially, I sort of thought, well, maybe it's because people aren't dying. Maybe it's because the people funding our work don't sort of appreciate the things that I appreciate. But over the years, I've realised actually it's not quite as straightforward as that. It's more that there are often constraints placed on funding bodies, particularly by politicians who want things to be rolled out quickly, and we're often, as evaluators, not left with enough time to trial things using randomised trials. So, but I will say that over the years there have been some sort of lowlights. One of them that I particularly remember was the school fruit and vegetable scheme. That we talk about something manageable that we can randomise. A box of fruit, in my mind, is pretty easy to randomise. And my colleagues over at NFER spent a long time trying to generate these complex statistical models to control for differences between the comparison and the intervention group for that evaluation. Particularly difficult as the ethnic makeup of the people receiving the fruit was actually quite different to that in the comparison group. It's very difficult, and all of these results are laced with caveats when we come to report them. So, right, I'm involved with lots of randomised trials now, so I'm very happy, and long may that continue. Let's hope we can see more. Right, common objections. What I'm going to talk about. Common objections. Are they possible? How are they implemented? Some examples and some common issues. Okay. Right. Thanks again to Ben for dealing with the first and the last point on the green column. Unethical and expensive. Another one that's often levelled at us is limited generalisability. Well, in the words of my colleagues up in Durham now, the Torgesons, do you want the right answer amongst a small group of people or the wrong answer amongst everybody? Blinding is not usually possible. The interaction between pupils and their education is too complex for a simple experiment. These are things that you could often level at an observational study as well. And it's important when we're talking about objections that we're not talking about objections for sort of quantitative research in general, and that we focus our objections on randomised trials. Standard implementation is assumed. Again, this is something which is not unique to a trial. Perhaps some of these things we can discuss more at length at the end if people have reservations that sort of fit into any of these categories on the left. Genuine problems on the right. Participants think randomisation is unethical. So when I'm running a trial and I'm organising meetings with stakeholders and so on at the beginning, I do try and set up some kind of discussion forum for often head teachers to be involved with understanding why we're doing it like this, why we're randomising pupils, why we're randomising schools. As it happens, I was due up in Bolton today to meet with a group of 10 odd head teachers for this very reason. But I was invited to come here instead, and I thought this would be fun. So here I am. But this is the kind of thing that we understand that if we actually communicate with the people involved, then they're likely to understand why they're doing it like this, and they're likely to stay the course of the trial. Number two, it does not tell us how the intervention works. This is indeed true, and we often run what we're calling a process evaluation alongside the trial to sort of try and understand why the intervention itself is working. And of course, there are plenty of examples from medicine where things have been trialled and we don't actually know how they work, but they work very well. So that's not necessarily a problem either. But it can be a problem, which is why I've got it in the red column. The complex interplay of systems and structures. This is a big one. And I think my next slide will sort of illustrate this. So, can we go to the next one? Thank you. So, this is this sort of what I'm calling this continuum of feasibility. There have been many trials, many interventions that I've seen over the years that are, yes, they are too complicated to randomise. Okay, so we might have a new exam system, a new funding arrangement, something which is involves a sort of complex interplay of several systems, schools, local authorities, and so on. And I don't think anybody's here is suggesting that we randomise that kind of thing. But as we go towards the left, there are plenty of examples come in where we can actually randomise. I've got boxes of fruit there again. Teaching materials. So the randomised trials that I have been involved with, that I'm involved with now, are all about randomising that kind of thing, something that's manageable, a set of materials, some methods, and so on. Aspects of the literacy and numeracy strategy could have been randomised, I think, as well. But the point is that historically that the bar, the sort of the line has been well to the left in education, and I'm hoping that well, we're already seeing it with the Education Endowment Foundation. The line is coming further to the right, which is great in my view. So, thank you. Right, yes, the landscape. So, some of you will be aware of what's going on at the moment. But there is quite a lot of trials activity out there. These organisations listed here are already running randomised trials in education, and have been for a number of years, not just since the Education Endowment Foundation started. So next to each one, I've listed an example of a trial that they've run, and I've worked with some of these organisations on trials, and we run them ourselves. And yes, the Department for Education has also funded trials in the past. Every Child Counts, and we're going to hear about one later today. So they do exist, and my understanding of the situation is that perhaps when they can exist, that they do, and that often we are just constrained in being able to get evaluators involved early enough. I think that the Every Child Counts trial was actually very complicated, I seem to remember. It had several different arms to it, and I have to confess I don't know what the outcome of that was, but it is an example of one that's happened in the past. And of course now we have the Education Endowment Foundation, who are funding trials both of relatively manageable, tiny interventions to rather large-scale interventions that require quite complex sort of manipulation. Yeah, so when are they implemented? We've got... we have to have a situation where the intervention's been successfully piloted. This is important for any kind of evaluation, randomised or not. And we need to get the evaluator involved well before intervention rollout. Well, we need to get schools' consent. We need to often obtain parental consent for randomisation. And, well, you know, you've heard already how that's not necessarily an unambiguous question of consent, because arguably, if we are in a position of equipoise where we don't know whether the intervention itself works or not, we are, you know, unethical, you know, ethically sound in our sort of procedures. But the we do have to make sure that at least there isn't sort of at least randomised trials evidence for the thing that we're trialling in advance, and so we have to be sure about our position in terms of equipoise. We have to be funding has to be available, and Ben already mentioned the waitlist control. So this idea that it's quite easy in education to randomise things in terms of when they're received, rather than what people are actually receiving, whether they receive it at all. But of course, even then, you have to think carefully about what you're going to write in that initial letter, because if the thing itself doesn't work at all, then actually you don't necessarily want to be giving that, rolling that out, particularly if it's detrimental. So, these things all have to be thought about in advance. Get the evaluator involved early, so that all of these sort of initial thoughts can be clarified. So I thought I'd also go through the sort of a classic order of events for a randomised trial in education over the next couple of slides. I think the big thing to bear in mind with this is that we are moving from perhaps an onlooker, which we were in an observational study or a quasi-experiment, where really we just watched what was going on. We didn't try and get our hands dirty, we left it happen. And we're moving to a manipulator. We were actually influencing what's going on in schools. And that really means that when you're sort of running a trial, to coin a phrase, it's like a sort of house of cards arrangement, where if one thing goes wrong, maybe you I don't know, somebody gets to find out about the random allocation too early, or it can sort of introduce internal bias very quickly, and a lot of these things they make you very worried compared to when you were working on observational studies, because you're setting that evidence bar that little bit higher, so you're really worried about internal validity, whereas before, we did all our complex statistical models and we were trying to control for the differences between comparison and intervention groups. We did our level best to do that, but we still put a caveat in the result. Actually, with trials, we're saying that there's a causal link between the intervention and the outcome. So, we really are very, very worried about all of these little things influencing internal validity. So, okay, let's go through this order of events then. The first one's an interesting one, which again is not normal for what we're used to. The specification of a primary and several possibly secondary outcomes in addition to subgroup analysis right up front. Okay, we're publishing our protocols now on the Education Endowment Foundation website, on controltrials.net, where the what we're actually going to measure is all listed. Okay, and that's what we will measure, and that's very unusual compared to the usual status quo when you've got all the data in front of you and exploring all the relationships, and somebody says, "Oh, why don't we look at this?" There are statistical reasons why that's problematic, and we are now specifying those things at the beginning. So, number 2, recruit schools and explain the method to schools. I suppose that's fairly standard. Number 3, eligibility criteria. Selecting the pupils. Again, we're manipulating things. We're actually selecting the pupils to be part of this, rather than generating a comparison group by matching or what have you to mirror those pupils. We're obtaining often passive parental consent, particularly for pupil randomisation. We administer the pretest to pupils. You'll notice we haven't randomised yet. And then number 6, we randomise. So pretest before randomisation. That's because rarely can we blind in these trials. The participants are aware of what group they're in, so we try and pretest before we actually randomise. So the group allocation is sort of kept secret until the last possible moment. Intervention runs in the experimental group. Control receives business as usual, or it simply goes on the waiting list to receive it later, or an alternative activity. Indeed, again, worried about just this, what we call the Hawthorne effect, being involved in the intervention, and therefore not the intervention itself making the difference, just the being involved. Number 8, administer the post-test. Yes, so test administrators shouldn't have been involved with the actual intervention. Intention to treat analysis. This is the idea that we sort of, those people that we randomise, they're the ones that we analyse. Okay, regardless of whether they've dropped out, it reflects reality. That's what we're trying to measure. And reporting as per the consort guidelines. These are guidelines that have been refined over the years for medical trials. Why reinvent the wheel? They're great for what we need. And I was fascinated to see that now you do some research for the Education Endowment Foundation. There are parts of the consort guidelines that are going in the contract. So I have to sign a contract to say I'm going to actually produce a report to those guidelines, and everything is pre-specified. Okay, thank you. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, so, right, yes, some examples. So historically, relatively few and far between, so sort of reading and writing materials. These were trials we did for publishers who happened to sort of get us involved early enough to be able to trial their materials. There was a mentoring scheme where business people came into schools to read to children that we trialed. And I've sort of listed these opportunist trials, as I call them, which actually Ben has already mentioned good examples of this. The HMRC one was one I remember, and we actually run quite a few like that within NFER. We're always having difficulty recruiting schools. It's very easy to enclose a glossy brochure with half the letters or a formal letter, and it's really, really easy to do. And whenever we've got a recruitment issue and we've got some doubt about how we do it, we do that, and we get the response rate data, which we're going to get anyway. It's a free trial, so we do that kind of stuff all the time. So in progress, we've got Intuition, which is some alcohol education materials for years 6 and 8. There's some other interventions, again, sort of fitting the very left-hand end of the scale here, so sort of teaching materials, reading and writing materials. And interestingly, on that front, we've got what the Education Endowment Foundation are trying to do is sort of generate a huge wealth of evidence on lots of little interventions that people have thought of, so that you then get a kind of effectively a list for teachers to choose from, where you get the actual effect size, so that's the sort of a comparable measure across the trials, and the cost of that intervention, so that people can make sort of more informed choices than they used to. There were guides to sort of literacy interventions in the past. Virtually none of them were trialled using randomised trials, and so really teachers, in my opinion, weren't really choosing from a level playing field. In fact, when you submitted a literacy intervention evaluation to this guide, it's Greg Brooks who used to, I think he may still do this, used to compile this guide. You felt you were actually disadvantaging yourself because you sort of put you had the sort of most rigorous evidence for your particular intervention, but what they're trying to do is sort of redo all that so that everything has to be randomised. Okay, so common issues. There's a nice, you see kind of randomisation actually crops up a couple of times towards the end of these issues. There's the standard ones about consent and recruitment and all of these sort of problems which may be exacerbated. What's the evidence actually? What's the evidence between recruiting for a randomised trial and an observational study? That would be an experiment on an experiment, and perhaps too far. But we feel that maybe we're getting difficulties in consent issues because we're randomising. So yes, some very specific issues coming down here, which we haven't got time to go into all of them. But there's a great story on one trial I worked on where we'd sort of advised our partners not to. When randomising pupils, we'd advised our sort of partners to make sure that the groups were the same size within each school. It was a pupil randomised trial. And unfortunately, they went away and ignored our advice. And in order to increase power, they decided to randomise the remainder of all of the pupils that were eligible in their schools to receive the control condition. And what this meant was that larger schools had larger control groups within them. And so this is what we were worried about. And I was amazed when I looked at the baseline data, because what we were worried about was just so profoundly important, because this was a trial in Northern Ireland. Larger schools were Catholic schools, and Catholic schools were higher attaining. So we actually had bias in our actual outcome measure right at the beginning. So that's an example of where, you have to be very careful about the different stages, and even something as relatively, you think, simple as randomisation actually may not be. So this is what I wanted to leave you with, which is really, I'm going through this process at the moment with a quasi-experimental design. We've got negative results, and it is throwing up questions about the methodology which would never have existed if the positive results had been forthcoming. And it's really sad. This is not the way we should do things, and we need to move away from it. Okay, thank you.